Hello everyone. Alright, so the next program in chapter 7 is population data. Alright, so if you have downloaded the source code from this book's companion website, you will find a file named uspopulation.txt in the chapter 7 folder. The file contains the mid-year population of the United States in thousands during the years 1950 through 1990. The first line in the file contains the population for 1950. The second line contains the population for 1951, and so forth. Write a program that reads the file's content into a list. The program should display the following data: the average annual change in population during the time period, the year with the greatest increase in population during the time period, the year with the smallest increase in population during the time period. And it goes ahead to say you can access the book's companion website at this URL. Okay, so I didn't buy so I bought the book from Amazon, so I don't have access to these text files, but I did some searching around online and I found the list. Now it's possible this list is accurate, it's possible it's not. But don't worry, the program we're about to create will work for any population data that you have, so it doesn't matter. As long as you have any text file with population data, it should work for it. So let's start. I'm going to first save this program. I'm going to save it in the location where we save all our programs on the desktop. I'm going to create a new folder for population data. This program, I'm going to call it population data. And then I'm going to save this file as populationdata.py. Okay. So I'm also going to go ahead and create a text file and paste that data that data that I told you that I have. I have it copied in the clipboard, so I'm just going to paste it. So on the Mac, I'm going to open text edit. If you're using text edit, well, before that, let me just create a new document. If you're using text edit, just make sure that in your preferences, it's set to plain text and not rich text. Rich text has some extra formatting behind the scenes, and if you save your file, it's going to be difficult. You're going to face some problems when you're reading from it because you're going to read all of these hidden extra characters behind the scenes. So just make sure it's set to plain text. All right. So like I said, I have the text. The data that I got copied, I'm going to paste it now. So this is the data. I'm not sure if it's correct, but like I said, this program will work for any population data that you have. Right, it's still going to work. If you have the original population data, it will work for it also. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to save this file in the same location where I saved the program. So over here in population data, this is our program. I'm going to save the file as, according to our question, it says uspopulation.txt. So I'm going to save it as uspopulation.txt, just like the question said. Alright, I'm going to keep it open here for reference. Alright, so it said we should write a program that reads the file's content into a list. Okay, so let's do that. I want us to break our program into functions. So the first function I want us to create is a function that's going to read the content, okay, these individual population data into a list. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to define a function. I'm going to call it read population data. It's going to be a long name, from file to list. So I like to use long names just because it's descriptive, but you can use any name that works for you. Any name that's okay for you, as long as you're comfortable with it. All right, so we'll figure out if this function needs any argument, okay, when it's called, so that we can define parameters. So let's just start. First thing this function is going to do is it's going to open a file, and that file is going to be our uspopulation.txt file. So I'm going to call the open function, and the open function takes in a couple of arguments. It takes in the file you want to open and what mode you want to open that file in. So I don't want to just directly type in the file name, which is uspopulation.txt here. I'm going to define this function in such a way that anyone who calls it has to provide a file name. And so I'm going to define a parameter for it. I'm going to call it file name. And then I'm going to pass that whatever value is passed to this function when it's called. I'm going to pass it for the file name section. The next argument it needs is what mode you want to open this file in. I'm going to open this file in read mode. So in double quotations or single quotations, you can type in R, which means we're opening this file in read mode. The open function will create a file object in memory, and it's going to return. It's going to send back the memory address of that file object. So when it's sending back the memory address of that file object, we need a place to store it. And so I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to create a variable that's going to store this memory address. I'm going to call it our population data file. This is going to be our population data file. And so this variable is going to hold the memory address of that file object we just created over here. In other words, it's going to point to that file object. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to read the very first line from this file. So I'm going to refer to the name of the file object, or the variable that points to the file object, and I'm going to call a method. Now a method is just a function that belongs to an object. Because this is an object, or because this variable points to the file object, this function now becomes a method because it's attached to it. Okay, so I'm going to use a dot, or the access operator, to access the method, which is read line. And so read line, okay, sorry, I still have the cough from drinking that hot chocolate I drank from school. So please bear with me if I cough here and there. Okay, so when I call read line, it's going to read this line, read what's on the line here, and then return that line to me. But there's something we need to know. That's very important. Anytime you are reading from a file, there's something called the read position. By default, the read position is, when you open the file for the first time, by default the read position is at the beginning of the very first line of the file. Right at the very beginning of the first line of the file, the read position is here. And so when you call read line is going to attempt to read the content of that line. It's going to read it, and it's going to return that data. So when it's returning that data, we need a place to store it. So I'm going to store that data in a variable. Now this data is going to be one particular population data, okay, with the population for a particular year. So I'm actually going to call it population for a year, right? Let's call it population for a year, okay, because that data is going to be a population for a year, one particular population for a year. When you call read line will read what's on the line, and automatically it's going to adjust the read position from the end of this line to the next line, okay, to the beginning of the next line, and wait for you. It's going to wait for you to call read line again before it reads the next line. And after reading that next line, it's going to adjust the read position from the end of that line to the next line. And it's going to wait for you, okay, to call read line. So it's not going to do it for all of the lines. When you call read line once, it's going to adjust the read position to the next line, the beginning of the next line, and wait for you to call read line again. So in our case, we call read line once, which when you open the file for the first time, it reads this line, and it returns that data, and it adjusts the read position from the end of that line to the next line and waits for us. So now the read position is here. This is according to our program so far. All right, so we read that line. Now, when you call read line and it returns an empty string, which that means that you've reached the end of the file. So let's say it finishes reading this last line and it adjusts the read position from the end of that line to the next line. There's nothing on the next line. So when you call read line and it tries to read a line, it's going to read nothing, and it's going to return nothing, which is an empty string. If it returns an empty string, it's either to reach the end of the file or the file is empty. We want to make sure that what we are getting back is not an empty string. We want to make sure the file is not empty, or there are no lines or basically there are no lines in there, because sometimes we may not see this file. Now we can see the contents in this file, but sometimes our job may be just to write the program, and then we'll be given the file name to open that file. We may not actually see the file to see if there's anything in there. So it's very essential to make sure the file contains something. If it doesn't contain something, then we don't read anything from it. All right, so we read the first line and we check to see if it's not an empty string. Remember, read line will return an empty string if there's nothing in the file or if it reaches the end of the file. Okay, so I'm going to use a while loop to check. I'm going to say while the content of population for a year, what's in the population for a year that we just got, is not equal to. I'm using the exclamation sign, which means not equal, and then the equal sign. So not equal to. While it's not equal to an empty string, okay? Now this is an empty string. This here is a space. This is an empty string. So while the content of population for a year is not equal to an empty string, if it's not equal to an empty string, that means it contains something, right? So now we can go ahead and use it. The question said we should read the file's content into a list. So while it's not equal to an empty string, while it contains something, then let's store that value in a list, which means we need a list. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to declare a list. This list is going to contain all our population data. So I'm going to call this population data list. Initially, it's going to be an empty string. So over here, while we make sure that the population for a year, the content of it is not equal to an empty string, which means it contains something, then let's append it to the list. So I'm going to refer to the list, population data list, and append, dot append. I'm going to append the population data to it. Now, when you read content from a file, they are read by default as strings. Fine, we are storing strings in the list. We don't want strings. We want these values stored in a list as integers so that we can actually do some math with them. Because over here you can see we are calculating the average, and we want to do some math with them. So before we append it to the list, we need to make sure we convert it to an int. Okay, before I append it, we need to make sure we convert it to an int. So before we append it over here, I'm going to do that. I'm going to call the int function around the population for a year value, or population for a year data. And then the int function is going to return whatever value you pass to it as an int. So when it's returning it, we need a place to store it. I'm going to store it back in that same variable population for a year. Okay, so I'm converting population for a year from a string to an int, and I'm storing it back in population for a year. Now we have an int here, so we can go ahead and append an int, which is the population for a year, as an int to the list. Okay. Now, going back to what I mentioned about read position. In our case, we read the first line. Okay, over here, we read the very first line here. And then it returned that value for us. The read position was adjusted from the end of this line to the next line. So we check to see, does it contain something? Okay, while it's not equal to an empty string. If it's not equal to an empty string, then it contains something. So if it contains something, we convert that value to an int and we append it to the list. Now remember, we have to call readline again to read the next line. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to refer to the file and call the readline method. And call the readline method. Let's do that. So the readline now is going to read the next line, and then it's going to adjust the read position from the end of that line to the next line. When it reads the next line, it's going to return that value for us. So when it's returning that value, we need a place to store it. Just like what we did here, we are going to do the same thing. I'm going to store the results back in population for a year. Now this becomes a loop. This is only going to run the first time. It's going to be the very first line. Until after that, after checking that it's not equal to an empty string and converting to an int and storing it in the list, we read it again, store it in population for a year, and then the loop checks again. If it's not equal to an empty string, while it's not equal to an empty string, we convert to an int, append to the list, and then we keep on repeating it. Remember, each time we are calling readline, as long as the content of the value we read before, okay, is not equal to an empty string. So by doing this, you're basically going through all the lines in the file and appending them to a list, okay, as integers. At some point, you reach the end of the file, and population for a year is going to be an empty string. This loop is only going to run while population for a year is not equal to an empty string. But if it's equal to an empty string, then this loop is going to be exited, right? So at the end of the loop, when it's done, we're going to have all the values in the US population.txt appended to the list. So we'll have our list ready. So when we have our list ready, let's go ahead and return our population data list. So that's all for this function. All right, the next thing we want to do is let's create a function that is going to calculate the difference, okay, the difference between the population increase, okay, the population increase between the years, okay. So what it means is for the very first year, for the very first year, this is the population for 1950 according to the question. It says over here that the first line in the file contains the population for 1950. So this is the population for 1950. So really the population change for this year is 0 because we don't have any year to compare with, right? So it's 0. But for the second year, you see over here the population was 151,868. But then in 1951, the population increased to 153,982. So we need to find the difference. We need to take this value, subtract this value to know the population increase. Okay. We need to know the population increase for this particular year. Like I said, this year we know it's 0 because there's no previous year to compare with. So the population difference is 0. But then for every other year, we're going to take that current year. We're going to take that current year and then subtract the previous year's population. Take the current year's population, subtract the previous year's population to know the population change, okay, or the population increase for that particular year. Then this is going to happen for every other year. So for this year, for example, we're going to take this population for that particular year and then subtract the population of the previous year to get the population change for this particular year. So let's create a function that is going to calculate the population change, okay, for all the years, okay, and then store the population change, for each year in a list. We're going to have another list that's going to store the population change, data. All right. Again, the very first year is going to be 0. So let's do that. I'm going to define a function. I'm going to call it, let's say, calculate the population change. I guess calculate the population change. All right, calculate population change. Let's move this. Calculate population change. Okay. So let's see. We'll figure out if this function needs any arguments, so that we can define the parameters. So this function is going to need the population data list, so that it can go through it. It needs this list so it can go through it and calculate the population change data. Okay. So let's create. Well, first of all, let's define this function so that it takes in the population change. Sorry, not the population change data. Let's create this function so that it takes in the population data list. Okay, because it's going to need that to calculate the population change data. So I'm going to create a parameter. I'm going to call it population data list. Okay, this is going to take in a list. It doesn't matter that the name of this is the same as the name of this. The scope of this variable here is within this calculate population change function, and then the scope of this population data list is within the read population data from file to list function. Okay, they are like twins. They are not the same. They're considered different because they are in two different functions. Okay, they don't see each other at all. All right, so once we have the population data list, we want to go through it. Okay, now we need to go through it with a loop. I like to use indexing to access I like to use indexing to go through lists, okay, or to write my loops. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to create a for loop and create a target variable. Since we are going through the population data list, each value we access is going to be a particular population data, or a particular population for a year. So let's create a target variable. Let's call it population for a year. I'm going to add index to it because actually this variable is going to be storing indexes or indices. I'll explain that in a second. So for population for a year index in range, I'm going to create a range here, and the range is going to be the length of the population data list that was passed to this function when it's called. So what it means is that if the population data list contains 10 items, for example, the len, calling the len function is going to return the length of this population data list. If it contains 10 items, then len population data list, length of this population data list is going to be 10. Right? I'm going to type in 10 here just to explain. Range 10 is going to create a range from 0 all the way to 9. 10 is not included. Okay, 10 is like the upper limit, but it's not included in the range. This is going to create a range from 0 all the way to 9. And these numbers 0 all the way to 9 are going to be assigned to the population for a year index as this loop is iterated. The very first time the loop iterates, population for a year index is going to store 0. Second time this loop iterates, the population for a year index is going to store 1 all the way to 9. Again, 10 is not included in the range. And these numbers are going to serve as the indices or the indexes we are going to use to access the element in the population data list. Okay, or to go through our population data list. this loop is still going to iterate 10 times. That is if the population data list contains 10 items. But the values or the range numbers 0 all the way to 9 are going to be assigned to this population for a year index as this loop is iterating. Okay, and in this population data list, the very first item, let's say it contains 10 items again. The very first item is going to have an index of 0, and the last item is going to have an index of 9 if it has 10 items. The last item will have an index of 1 less than the length of the list. So the length of the list is 10, then the index of the last item is going to be 9. 1 less than the length of the list. The length of the list is 10. Okay, this is assuming the length of the list is 10. So I'm not going to type in 10 for the range here. I'm going to use length of this list, because the length of this list can vary, can change. Okay, and we're going to be assigning the indices, okay, to this variable. What we want to do is we want to, like I said, except the first year, for every other year we want to take that population for that particular year and subtract the population for the previous year from it to get the population change for that year. Okay, so for this year, for example, we take the population for this year, we subtract the population of the previous year, and we get the population change for this particular year. So let's go through it. But for the very first year, we know the population change is 0 because, again, we don't have any previous year to find a difference. All right, so the population change is 0. So what I'm going to do is, we know the very first item here will have an index of 0. And we know that the first time this loop iterates, population for a year index is going to be 0, which is referring to the very first item here. We can use that to refer to the first item here. So if, while it's going through the list, okay, or while it's looping, if at any time the population for a year index, okay, is equal to 0, which means if we're referring to the first population data, or the data for the 1950, the very first year, then we want to store, or the population change is going to be 0. So we want to store that 0 to a list. Now, with this function, actually, we want to have a list at the end of it that contains all the population change data. So we need a list. We need a list to do that. So let's come up here and create a list. I'm going to create a list. I'm going to call it population change data. This is the population data itself, which is these. But the population change data is going to be the difference in population increase, okay? When the, basically the difference in population increase between these years. So population change data, it's going to be a list. I'm going to add the word list to it just so it's descriptive. Population change data list. Initially, it's going to be an empty list. So for the very first year, if we are referring to the first item in population data, so if the population for a year index is 0, then we want to append to this list 0. Okay, so I'm referring to that list, population change data list, okay, dot append. I want to append the value 0 to it. And then else means that the index is not 0. Else means we're not referring to this first year over here. We're referring to either this one which has index 1, either this one which has index 2, so on and so forth. So for each time we want to take the current year, okay, and subtract the population of the previous year. We want to take the population of the current year, subtract the population of the previous year to get the population change for that particular year, okay, and then store it in the population change data list. Okay, so else means we're not referring to the first one, so in that case we want to append to this list. But what do we want to append to it? We want to append, okay, the population for that particular year. And the way we access the population for that particular year case is referring to the population data list, okay, and then referring to that the population for the particular, the current population we are on as we are iterating through the loop. We refer to that current population we are on using the population for a year index. So we take the population for the current year, okay, and then we subtract, okay, by the population of the previous year. Okay, so I'm taking out the population of the previous year, and the way we access that is by subtracting 1 from the index. So if this is index 1, if we are referring to this value here which has an index 1, okay, then we are taking that current year's population, subtracting the previous year's population. So referring to the population data list, the previous year will have 1 less than this index. If this index is 1, then 1 minus 0 is going to be this index is 1, then 1 minus 1, right? 1 minus 1 over here is going to be 0, and 0 will refer to the index of the previous year. Okay, so that's what we're doing. If you want, you can actually do this separately on another on another line, store that value in a variable, but we're doing it here. Okay, so you can see this line over here. This gray line is like a guideline for me not to exceed 79 characters on the line. So it's a Python standard not to exceed 79 characters on the line, and I want to follow that. I want to stick with that. So I'm going to break this line into two visually, right? Visually, I'm going to break this line into two, but hold on. I wasn't supposed to put a colon here, so let me just remove it. I wasn't supposed to do that. All right, so I want to break this line into two, so I'm going to break it somewhere around, let's see, here, okay? Before you break a line on Python, you have to type in a backslash. So I'm going to type in a backslash and hit enter, okay? I'm still exceeding the line over here, so I'm going to break it somewhere around here. Type in a backslash, hit enter. Okay, now I haven't exceeded this line. So it doesn't affect its functionality. It doesn't, it's a visual thing, but it's a Python standard and I want to follow it. Okay. All right, so I'm done with that. By the time this loop is done, outside the loop, we'll have all the population change data stored or in the population change data list. And so when we are done with that, let's return the population change data list. Okay, and then we're done with this function. All right, so the next thing we need to calculate over here. So it says the average, we should display the average annual change in population during the time period. All right, so let's define a function that's going to calculate the average annual change in population. So if it's going to calculate the average annual change in population, then it needs the then it needs the population change data list, right? The list that contains all the population change data. And what we're going to do is we're going to add all the values in that population change data list and divide by how many years there are, or divide by how many population change data we have, okay, in that list. So let's first define a parameter for this function. It's going to need the population change data list. I'm going to define a parameter with the same name. Again, it doesn't matter. These names do not see each other. The scope of this list name here is within this calculate average annual change in population function, and the scope of this one here is within the calculate population change function. Okay, they don't see each other at all. They are considered different because they are in two different functions, and we're going to do this for all of them throughout our program. We're going to have similar names like that. All right, so the way we calculate the average annual change is by, again, summing all the numbers in this list, okay, and then dividing by how many population change data there are. So we're going to create a loop to go through it. Again, I like to use indexing to go through it. So I'm going to create a for loop. I'm going to create a target variable. Since we are going through the population change data list, then each value we are accessing is going to be the population change data for a year. Okay, so I'm going to say for population change data index. Let's call it. You can actually do for a year index. It's a long name. But this helps me know exactly what values I'm accessing. But use whatever name makes sense to you. All right. So for population change, let's see. For population change data for a year index, okay, in range, I'm going to create a range of the length, just like what we did above, of the population change data list. Okay, so similar to what I explained above. If the population change data list contains 10 items, for example, then the range will be from 0 all the way to 9. 10 is like the upper limits not included, okay? And numbers 0 to 9, they're going to be assigned to population change data for a year index as this loop is iterating. The very first time it iterates, 0 is going to be assigned to population change data for a year index. Second time is going to iterate. 1 is going to be assigned to this variable population change data for a year index. And we're going to use these values to access the individual element in the population change data list. Okay, so I can see I'm exceeding this line over here again, so I'm going to break it somewhere around here. Before I break any line, I type in the backslash and enter. Okay, we're still in the loop. So each time, what I want to do is I want to access that particular population change data and then sum it up. So if we want to sum it up, then we need a place to accumulate all of it. We need an accumulator. So I'm going to create a variable where that's going to store all the sum of all the numbers in that list. I'm going to call it total population change data, I guess, or let's call it total population change. I'm going to set it initially to 0. I mean, initializing it to 0 because when we're about to count, right, or add something up, initially it's 0. So each time we want to go through or access the particular population change data, so I'm going to refer to the population change data list because that's a list that contains all the population change data, and access that particular population change data that we are on while we are iterating through the loop. And the way I access the particular population change data is by its index. It's by the population change data for a year index. I access that value. Okay, this is me accessing it. But what we really want to do is add it to total population change, the total population change, right? So the total, let's just copy it. So the total population change is going to be equal to what's already stored in the total population change, okay, plus the particular population change data that we just accessed. Okay, so we know in the population change data list, the very first population data, we know in the population change data list, okay, the population change for this particular year is 0. The very first one is 0. We know the second one is going to be, let's say the difference between this and this second value and this first value is, let's say, 2000. So we know in the population change data list, the first item or the first population change, okay, which is for this one, is going to be 0. The second population change, let's assume, is 2000. So the first one is 0. If the first one is 0, what we want to do is we're going to take the total population change, which is 0. We're going to add it up to 0. Okay, so 0 plus 0 gives us 0. Okay, and then we store 0 all the way back in total population change. So we access the second population change data, which is, let's say, 2000, assuming. We take what's stored in population change data, which is 0. We take 0. Okay, so sorry, what's stored in the total population change, which is 0. So we take 0 and we add it to 2000, which is, assuming that the next value is 2000. So 0 plus 2000 gives us 2000. And we take 2000 and we store it all the way in total population change, and so on and so forth. So we are going to basically add up the next value to the total population change. We are accumulating, we are adding it all up. By the time this loop is done, we're going to have the total population change for it's going to add up all the different population change data in our population change data list. Okay, I'm exceeding this line here. I want to break it somewhere around here. Before I break the line, I type in a backslash, hit enter. Okay, so I have our total population change here. Sorry, I have our total population change here. Let me just break this here, put a line break just so it's a bit clear. So I have the total population change, and to calculate the average annual change in population, it's the total population change divided by how many items there are in this population change data list, or how many years there are. Okay, how many population change data there is, right, or there are. So I'm going to take our total population change, okay, outside this loop. When we are done calculating our total population change, we get our total population change and we divide it by how many items there are, which is basically representing how many years there are. And the way I access how many items are in this, or how many years there are, is by calling the len function, len, and I'm going to pass in the population change data list. It's going to return how many items there are in this population change data list. And then that is going to be our average annual change in population. So let's call it average annual change in population. This way. Okay, so this is our average annual change in population. I'm exceeding this line. I'm going to break it somewhere around here. I'm going to type in the backslash, hit enter. Okay, now when we have our average annual change in population, let's go ahead and return it. Return it to any part of our code that calls this function. So let's return our average annual change in population. Then we are done with that.